You are standing in front of an ancient text that looks weirdly normal at first. It is a king list. Names, cities, reign lengths. Exactly the kind of thing you expect from a civilization that loved records, grain totals, and writing on damp clay like it was the world's oldest spreadsheet. Then you hit the first number. One king rules for 28,800 years. The next gets 36,000. Another gets 43,200. At that point, this is no longer a normal royal record. This is history having a fever dream. And now the real question snaps into focus. If the Sumerian King List is a real Mesopotamian document, why does it sound half like a serious chronicle and half like someone forgot how humans work? The first thing to know is that the Sumerian King List is real, not secret, not hidden, not too shocking for scholars. It survives in several ancient copies written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing used in Mesopotamia. The most famous copy is a four-sided clay prism, now in Oxford, covered with tiny signs. When modern historians say the Sumerian King List, they mean this whole group of related texts copied and changed over time. And the text is trying to do something very specific. It lists rulers. It tells you which city held kingship. It gives reign lengths. And it moves from the deep past toward the writer's more familiar world. So yes, it is a list. But it is not just a list. It is more like an ancient political memory machine. It takes a messy past full of rival cities, half-remembered rulers, flood stories, and sacred ideas about power, then squeezes all of that into one clean line. One city gets kingship, then another, then another. It feels tidy, almost suspiciously tidy. Like if someone tried to explain all of modern history by saying only one country at a time was allowed to matter. Convenient, weird, very official looking. That is why the impossible reigns matter so much. They are not random nonsense sitting beside real names. They are doing a job. To see that job, you have to step into southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You are in a world of mud brick cities, canals, temple complexes, and local gods. Cities like Eridu, Uruk, Kish, and Nippur are not just dots on a map. They are proud, competitive places with their own rulers, priests, and sacred identities. In that world, kingship is not treated like a purely human invention. The list opens with a line famous for a reason. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That is not office paperwork. That is cosmic language. Power does not just appear because some guy has a nice hat and a scary army. Power arrives from above. Then the text gets even stranger. It begins before the flood, before the world you can mostly picture, before anything feels properly human-sized. In the best-known version, 8 kings rule in 5 cities before the flood sweeps over the land. Alulim of Eridu reigns for 28,800 years. Alongar gets 36,000. And Menluana gets 43,200. Altogether, these pre-flood kings rule for 241,200 years. That is not one scribal typo. That is not one tired clay tablet accountant having a bad afternoon. That is a whole system of gigantic numbers. And the numbers are neat. Many are clean multiples in the Mesopotamian base 60 counting system. That means a counting system built around the number 60. The same reason we still have 60 minutes in an hour. So this is not sloppy math. It is deliberate design. That is your first big clue. The list is not mainly asking you to imagine a man somehow surviving long enough to celebrate his 38th birthday. No cake is that big. The huge reigns are signals. They tell you that the earliest age of kingship belongs to a different kind of time. In many ancient traditions, the beginning of the world is not normal-sized. First kings are bigger. First heroes are stronger. First ages are closer to the gods. The Sumerian King List does the same thing with numbers. It stretches time until the opening of history feels sacred, distant, and heavy with authority. The reigns are impossible on purpose. And then comes one of the coldest lines in ancient literature. After those vast ages and early cities, the text simply says the flood swept over. No long emotional speech, no panic, No dramatic music, just a brutal reset. The world before the flood ends. Kingship disappears with it. Then, after the flood, kingship descends from heaven again, this time to Kish. That structure matters. The flood is not a random disaster, dropped into the middle of the story like nature rage quit the civilization. It is the hinge. It splits time into two worlds. The huge, mythic age before the flood, and the more human world after it. The list is building a staircase down from cosmic time into political time. This flood line also connects the King List to a much larger Mesopotamian tradition. Ancient Iraq preserved several flood stories, including tales linked to figures like Ziusudra and later Utnapishtim. The details change from text to text, but the basic idea is familiar. There was a world before a great flood, and that flood marked a break in human memory. Even the last pre-flood city on the King List, Shuruppak, shows up in flood traditions elsewhere. So the King List is not inventing the flood out of nowhere. It is using a story the culture already took seriously, then turning it into a historical dividing line. Think of it as a cosmic filing cabinet. Everything before the flood goes in one drawer. Everything after goes in another. What happens next is the part that makes the whole document so fascinating. The reign lengths start shrinking, not immediately to normal, but downward. Hundreds of years, then less. The air gets thinner. The world starts to feel more recognizable. And as you move through the list, you start meeting names that are not just floating in legend. Gilgamesh appears, which already tells you the line between memory and myth is very porous here. But later, you also get rulers like Enmebaragesi of Kish, who is known from independent inscriptions outside the King List. That is the open loop. The text really does move from impossible kings into a world that contains historically believable dynasties and rulers. Now, if this were a modern timeline, that mix would be a disaster. Historians would throw the whole thing out like a spreadsheet with dragons in column C. But the King List is not trying to be a modern timeline from beginning to end. It is trying to connect the ruler's present to the deepest possible past. It wants kingship to look continuous, unbroken, God-given, older than cities, older than floods, older than ordinary memory. That is why the pre-flood section sits beside later dynasties, instead of being stored on a separate myth shelf. For the people shaping this text, those shelves are not built the way we build them. Myth, political legitimacy, and remembered history are all crowded into the same room, probably arguing over seating. There is another reason scholars take the text seriously, without taking every line literally. The list is selective in a very revealing way. It usually presents kingship as if it belongs to one city at a time, moving from place to place in a single chain. Real Mesopotamia was messier than that. Different cities had rulers at the same time. Dynasties overlapped. Alliances shifted. Rivals did not politely wait off-screen until it was their turn. The King List edits that chaos into a relay race. One baton, one legal line, one rightful kingship. That is not a mistake. That is ideology. And ideology just means a set of ideas used to explain who should have power and why. The text is not just remembering the past, it is disciplining the past. This is where city rivalry enters the story. Many scholars think the King List took shape, at least in one major form, during a period when rulers in Mesopotamia needed strong claims to legitimacy, especially after political upheaval. In simple terms, leaders needed a reason to say, "We are the rightful ones now. Please ignore the extremely complicated mess behind the curtain." The version we know best seems especially friendly to the dynasty of Isin. That does not mean someone sat down and forged the whole thing like a fake diploma. It means older traditions were organized, expanded, and framed to serve later political needs. If kingship has passed in one sacred chain from heaven, through ancient cities, all the way to your dynasty, your rivals are not just annoying neighbors. They are interruptions. The past becomes campaign material, but in clay. That also explains why the copies do not all agree perfectly. There is no single perfect master copy descending unchanged from the beginning of time, glowing softly in a temple basement. There are multiple manuscripts from different places and periods, with differences in names, totals, and details. Some are damaged. Some preserve lines others do not. That matters because it shows the King List is a living composition, not a frozen block. Scribes are not photocopiers. They are transmitters, editors, and sometimes quiet political assistants. The basic shape stays stable enough to recognize, but the text moves through time like other powerful traditions do. It gets copied because it matters, and it matters because it tells rulers where they belong in the story. So what do experts still argue about? Quite a bit. They do not seriously argue over whether the early kings literally ruled for tens of thousands of years. That is not the main debate. The real debate is how to read the blend. How much genuine early memory survives inside the legendary material? Do some names preserve very old local traditions? Are the giant numbers mostly symbolic, mostly mathematical convention, or both? Was the list first composed under one dynasty and later reworked by another? Those are hard questions, because ancient texts do not come with a neat label saying, "Myth begins here," and political messaging starts on line 42. Very rude of them, honestly. The King List resists clean boxes. That is why it is so useful. And that brings us back to the central question. Why does a real Mesopotamian text place impossible reign lengths beside recognizable kings? Because it is doing two jobs at once. It is preserving a vision of the past, and it is legitimizing power in the present. The impossible reigns are not failed history. They are mythic claims about the age and sacred status of kingship. They push rulership back into a pre-flood world, a world closer to the gods and farther from ordinary human limits. Then, as the list moves forward, it gradually brings that sacred office down into the historical world of cities, dynasties, and rulers we can sometimes confirm from other sources. So when you read that first absurd number and feel your brain hit the brakes, that reaction is part of the experience. The text wants the beginning to feel remote, overwhelming, and bigger than life. It wants kingship to arrive with the weight of heaven behind it, and by the time the list reaches rulers who feel more historical, the point has already been made. Their authority is not just local, it is plugged into a chain that stretches through flood, myth, and sacred time. The Sumerian King List is not asking you to believe in immortal kings. It is showing you how a civilization made power look ancient. The next time you see that clay prism, or a translation of those impossible reigns, do not read it like a broken history book. Read it like a civilization trying to weld cosmic memory to real politics. In a few lines of cuneiform, you can watch myth turn into legitimacy, city rivalry turn into order, and the flood become the border between sacred time and human time. That is why the King List still feels so unsettling. It looks like a record. It sounds like history. But underneath, it is a machine for making kingship feel older than the world it needs it.